Everybody, thank you for joining us for our closing plenary toward pay equity in publishing careers. I'm very pleased to introduce our next guest, Becca Bostock, Dominique Moore, Amy Sherman, and Alice Meadows, who will be moderating. This one is a kind of tie-in to our Publishing Career Builder series. We run a monthly career webinar series, and if you would like to be invited to join any of those, please send me an email. Pooja will be putting some links into the chat, into the audience chat. Please do put your questions in the interact button, which you'll see at the bottom of your screen. So don't put questions in the chat, but you could definitely chat with each other in the chat. And I'm going to go off screen in a second, but I just wanted to mention, I had seen this conversation with these professionals in the Scholarly Kitchen and on the HNet book channel blog, and invited them to talk about this very important issue. And so I'm pleased to turn it over to Alice and the rest.
Thanks, John, and hi, everybody. I'm Alice Meadows. I'm very delighted to be here moderating this panel. Thank you, John, for the invitation. I am the Director of Community Engagement at NISO, which is the National Information Standards Organisation. And despite my rather oldie English accent, I'm actually based in New England, in Boston. We had a big storm that knocked out a lot of electricity last night, but thankfully all in one piece here, so hopefully we'll stay that way. As you can tell, I'm the kind of oldie on this panel, and was a little surprised, I guess, in some ways to be asked to moderate, but I was lucky enough to do a really fantastic interview with Becca and Don on the Scholarly Kitchen about the work that they've been doing on early career pay equity. And I think that was what prompted the invitation. But I was also very happy to be invited because actually gender pay equity is something that I have a strong interest in. Sort of gender equity in general was what initially kicked off my interest in issues around diversity, equity and inclusion 10, 12 years ago or so now. So although I think most of the focus of today will be thinking about early career pay equity and the issues around that, I think other aspects of gender pay equity may pop up from time to time as well. We're going to keep this very informal. There's no slides. It's just going to be sort of a conversation between us and hopefully between you as well. So as John said, please do add your questions or comments actually in the question box. We'll try and keep an eye on those, and I'll try to fit them in sort of around the questions that we have prepared for the panelists. So with that, I'm going to hand over to each of the panelists in turn, and we're going to start with sort of introductions, fairly informal introductions. So for each of you, I'd like you to tell us a little bit about what your journey in scholarly publishing has been. How did you get into this community in the first place, and what your current role is, how you got to your current role, and how you have been impacted by pay equity, either sort of now or as you've progressed through your career. So can we start with you, please, Becca?
Yeah, hi. Thank you for having me today. Becca Bostock. I'm an associate editor at Ohio State University Press. And I'm also the subventions coordinator there. So I wear many hats in my day-to-day. I have been at OSUP and in scholarly publishing for 5 years and change. And I went to grad school into scholarly publishing. So OSU is the class that I have been at. And I started out as a part-time editorial assistant and have had several phases of promotion up to associate editor at this point, which means that I both assist other editors and acquire my own in Victorian studies. And I think it's hard to say how of us are not impacted by pay equity at this point, but I think I pretty targeted conversations with Dom when we were coworkers about the ways that we were both supplementing our income with additional outside of our full-time jobs. And this was something that we realized that we had a lot in common about, and that we felt other people probably did too. So it became sort of a daily conversation that we were having that has just snowballed, I think, into a greater public discourse in the last couple of years that we're happy to be continuing here today.
Thanks, Becca. Dawn, on to you, please.
Hi, I'm Donna Rante, and I'm editor-in-chief at the University of Texas Press. I got my start in publishing as an undergrad at University of Arizona. I was an English major and a classics minor, and I always joke that I was like getting really good at crossword puzzles because all these like obscure Greek mythology and Egyptian gods I knew about. But I was like, what job is there for me? And it was a very good fortune that a listserv email came across my inbox for an internship at the University of Arizona Press in the acquisitions department. I applied and got it. It was an unpaid internship, but I did receive credit for it. It was a semester long, and I fell in love with the idea that you could work with people who are experts in what they're doing and make books about it. And I decided to pursue it. I had a little bit of a not direct from internship to publishing. It was actually between about 10 years between my internship and like becoming an editor. But in between then I did a master's, I did a scholarly publishing certificate program at Arizona State University. And I got my first paid job at University of Illinois Press as an assistant acquisitions editor in 2011. And at Illinois, I was able to move from assistant to editor to senior acquisitions editor, acquiring various series. And I started at University of Texas Press about a year ago, where I acquire in Black Studies, Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies, Texas history, sports studies, American studies. I really love the fields I'm working in. I became interested in pay equity when I realized I had a pay inequity. I think a lot of the times we're finding out about these things. It was kind of the classic kind of typical like percentages you read in publishing industry, like the 13% gender pay inequity. And you know, through trying to navigate advocating for myself, I learned a lot. There's always more to learn. And now as a manager, I'm always interested in learning more and trying to be very aware of all the different things to consider and the different inequities. And like Alice, I was really interested in the work that Becca and Dawn were doing and was grateful that they were willing to contribute a piece to the Feeding the Elephant forum on the HNet book channel that John mentioned. And I'm a huge fan of Amy's thoughts on professional development and whatnot, and was grateful for her contribution too. So I'm just really excited that we're all at a place, not just the group of us, but like as an industry where we can talk about these things openly.
Thanks, Dawn. I'm just going to put in a quick plug for Dawn as well, because my other hat that I wear at the moment is I'm the president of the Society for Scholarly Publishing, SSP, this year, which is a huge honour. And Dawn and I got to know each other because she was an SSP fellow a few years ago. And it's a wonderful programme. So if any of you are interested, I strongly encourage you to look into that in the future. But anyway, quick promotional break there. Thank you, Dawn. Amy, on to you, please.
Okay. I'm Amy Sherman. I'm the managing editor for manuscript editorial at the University of Pittsburgh Press. I've been here for coming up on 11 years. This is weird for me to say. I decided I wanted to go into publishing when I was in college. I was an English major. I worked at a bookstore and at the Student Writing Center. I went to grad school for a master's in English also, where I taught composition, and I got a part-time editorial assistant job at the University Press of Kansas. And for me, that was a very lucky break. For all I know, that was maybe the only entry-level job in book publishing in the state at the time. And it was only 10 hours a week, so I could take it on top of school and teaching. And I was their second choice, so I was doubly lucky there. So then after graduating, I applied for as many jobs in publishing as I could, everywhere I could. And I had been connected to someone who worked at one of the big trade houses in New York, and we'd had a phone conversation about how she got started. And she told me about what that was like for her. She moved to New York first. She couch surfed. She was working at a grocery store, not only for the pay, but also for like discounted food. And so her advice was that you really had to move first in order to be considered for entry-level jobs then. So in my experience, that was true insofar as the only trade New York interview that I ever got, I got turned down after it turned out that the person who had been doing the initial screening had let me through like when she shouldn't have. They ended up reposting the job and hiring a local candidate. So I'm kind of a risk-averse person, and making that kind of a move was too big of a leap and kind of beyond my finances at the time. I was staying with a family member while I was job hunting. So I couldn't really afford to relocate to such an expensive city and work at an unpaid internship once I got there. So I continued applying. I got a couple of interviews at university presses. I eventually got hired as a full-time editorial assistant at Pitt. And it's different depending on the press, but the way things were working during my time as an editorial assistant at our press, my job didn't actually include any like acquiring or reading manuscripts. It was really like processing reviewer payments and making sure the manuscripts were in good enough shape to transmit, that kind of thing. My starting pay was $25,000, which translates to $31,450 today, according to an inflation calculator that I checked sometimes. And that was tough. Like I couldn't afford internet at home that first year. I've never owned a car, that kind of thing. So I started freelancing as soon as I could, but I couldn't get like real editing work right away without editing experience. That's kind of a catch-22 for editing, unfortunately. So I was just doing like very labor-intensive, low-paying work, doing SEO optimization and OCR scanning corrections for a magazine. So then, even though I was in the acquisitions department, our managing editor took a chance on me and helped me kind of learn the basics of copy editing. I subcontracted a chapter here and there for freelance work that he was doing, and eventually he let me copy edit full manuscripts for the press. And I wanted that because I needed to get experience in order to get freelance copy editing work. And the sort of in-house rationale was any work that I take on in-house, we don't have to pay a freelancer to do. So it's kind of like a mutually beneficial arrangement. And so then copy editing became more and more part of my job. And I had a foot in kind of both departments for a while. But there wasn't really a path for me to move up in acquisitions. And so like so often you'll get the advice that to move up, you need to move elsewhere, take a lateral move and go somewhere else. But you know, despite my best efforts, I wasn't getting hired anywhere. The reasons I was given were a lack of actual acquisitions experience and location. So I had a couple of interviews where I was a final candidate, but they hired someone local, even though I was like emphasizing how willing I was to move like immediately. So there wasn't like a path up in acquisitions in-house, and I couldn't get hired anywhere else, but there was a need in manuscript editorial. So I eventually shifted over. And I realize that I've gone on for a bit here, and I'm sorry, I will talk less during later answers, but just a couple of things that I wanted to emphasize from my experience were during the time when I was early career, how much location played a role. Like I had multiple instances of not being able to get hired without already living where the job was, which would have entailed in taking on an enormous amount of debt that I really didn't feel comfortable with. And then secondly, how my career trajectory, such as it is, has been kind of predicated on the experience that I got specifically for work that I was doing on top of my full-time job in order to make ends meet. So I didn't start out as a copy editor. I don't plan to stay a copy editor forever, but I did need to pay the bills. And as far as I know, there aren't really opportunities for an EA to do freelance acquisitions on the side as a side hustle. Or as a way to fill out places where, you know, you might not be getting the kind of professional development that you need to either move up or over. And so copy editing was kind of what I pursued as an extracurricular. And then that ended up kind of reflecting onto my full-time career path. So here we are now.
Thank you. That was really helpful, Amy. And last but definitely not least, Dom, how about you?
Everybody, I'm Dominique, well, Dominique, Dom for short. And I would say the way I would, if I had to qualify or describe my trajectory, I would say things happened really slowly and then they happened really fast. So I took my first job in publishing right after I finished grad school. I'd moved back to where I'd gone to undergrad. I moved back from LA. And so I kind of took the first job that I can't remember how probably 100 jobs. Like I interviewed for everything. I'm like, I need a job. And so I ended up by happenstance getting a job at the small journal article or just small journal publisher in town in Champaign. And so I was there for about, I think it might have been about 18 months. And so I progressively kind of worked my up from kind of being at the bottom of the press there. And then I ended up taking on the managing editor of their books program. And so I ended up becoming their books program lead by the time I left. And I realized that I really loved talking with authors about, fleshing out journal article ideas and like seeing how they could be these large, robust book projects. And so I was there for about 18 months and I ended up leaving. And I started doing some freelance copy editing and proofreading full time. I did that for about a year, a little under a year. And I missed having colleagues. I missed having coworkers. I missed being in an office, surprisingly. And so I took a job as a managing editor, so more on the production side of a smallish trade and professional press down there, again, in Champaign. And then I like to say about 6 months later, my life imploded. And I was kind of looking for options. It has nothing to do, but I went through a really bad breakup. And so I was like, well, I don't know what I'm going to do. Like, I have to figure out where I'm going to go after this. And I applied for quite a few jobs in the UP world and I couldn't get anything. I had known I wanted to move into acquisitions. And I would like to say, like, I feel like I discovered this like ceiling. I'm like, feels like there's like a wall here and I don't know what it is and I don't know how to move around it. And I happened to be looking online one day and I saw, it's called the Andrew Mellon University Press Diversity Fellowship. And so the idea of it is to bring people from marginalized backgrounds into acquisitions, because I always say like there is quite a ceiling in acquisitions, which I think Amy spoke to. And so it's the idea of you don't have any experience, if you didn't have an internship, you really don't have an in into acquisitions. And so I ended up getting the fellowship at OSU, Ohio State University, and that's where I met Becca. And I think what was super interesting is that we discovered when I started there, because I was getting my salary paid through the foundation. And so the foundation said what my salary was. And it surprisingly, if I'm not mistaken, I think I came in and I was making more than Becca at that point, which was wild when we discovered that. And so also part of it was I had to move out of state. So I moved from Champaign to Columbus, Ohio. And I think they gave me I had like 3 months to figure out how to get there. So I had to like borrow some money from a family member. They ended up telling me, it's a 14-month fellowship. There's not a job here after that. So the idea is that you have to hopefully find a job after that. They're like going to spin me back on the job market. So I remember being really worried because I'm like, I'm leaving this like actual job position for this fellowship that I don't know if I'll actually get into the industry. And so I like made a deal with one of my best friends. She's like, if you don't get it, you can just come sleep on my couch, in 14 months, like just go ahead and do it. What's the worst that can happen? And so I go out there and I discovered that I love it. Like I thought I would. I loved acquisitions work. Had a great mentor there. And so we had decided about 6 months into the fellowship, I was like, well, let's get some interview experience so that when I have to do my actual interviews 6 months from now, I'll feel like I know what I'm talking about. And so I ended up getting a couple of interviews, one of them being at UNC Press, University of North Carolina. And I ended up honestly surprisingly getting the position, and that wasn't really the plan. The plan was I was like, worst case scenario, I'll just get some interview experience. And so I then had to turn around. I had moved out there I moved to Columbus and I can't remember the year anymore. Was that 2019? Yeah, in the summer of 2019, June of 2019. And then I ended up interviewing for a job in October of 2019. And I had to be out there in 8 weeks. And so I turned around, I did another out-of-state move, and I moved to North Carolina. And I started in December 1st. I always say I will never do that again. And so I told them, I'm like, I hope you guys like me because I'm here to stay. I'm not moving anymore. I'm not moving jobs. I've done 3 new jobs in the past year and a half, and I'm done. And so I was there as an assistant editor for about a year. And then the editor-in-chief of University of Illinois Press actually reached out to me and said that he thought that my qualifications might fit the position that they were trying to fill, which funnily enough was Dawn's position at the press. And so I said, Worst case scenario, it's some good interview experience for a full editor position. And so I decided to go ahead and, throw my hat in the ring, so to speak. And so I ended up getting the job, surprisingly. And so then that was in December of last year. Yeah, December of 2020. And then I started at the University of Illinois in February of 21. So about 8 months ago, I think, at this point. And so that's the major arc. And in between all of that, I was still doing a bunch of freelance work. I still do a little bit of freelance. I say now that I at least get to just do projects I really am interested in. I was doing a lot of proofreading of like science textbooks for a while to supplement my income, because I like to say I had moved into this like kind of fellowship and really early career trajectory, but I had like big girl bills at this point. Like I had a car note and all this stuff that like I had that I couldn't get rid of at that point. And so I was doing, I think at the hardest times, I was probably putting in like 70, 80 hours of working, because I was working a full-time job and I was coming home and I was like editing a textbook a week at one point just to kind of supplement all the income. And so, like I said, I finally was able to stop doing that with this new move into this full editor position. And here I acquire in Black studies and American ethnic studies and gender, women, and sexuality studies.
Cool. Thank you. Thank you all so much. I think that's really helpful context for the rest of our conversation. So I want to go on, and a couple of you sort of alluded to this, but I'd like to ask you more specifically about the kind of lessons that you've learned along the way that you would share with people who are at the beginning of their careers, or just thinking about moving into scholarly publishing, either as a first job or possibly as a sort of a job moving careers. As I say, I think there's been a little some allusions to this. I mean, one of the lessons I've learned, and that I think you kind of definitely alluded to, Dom, is this is a small world. There's lots of interconnections that may or may not be immediately obvious, but I think being aware of that as you move around the scholarly publishing world is a good thing. But what lessons would you like to share with people who are sort of earlier in their careers than you are? Becca, maybe we'll start back with you if we may.
I think that, we've all touched on it a little bit, but that it is often difficult to support yourself off of a single income from your full-time job when you are early in your publishing career. I think that many of us have that. Like Amy and Dom, I still work another job, and mine isn't even tangentially related to publishing. I've worked it the entire time. It's retail-based. It's something that you do have to have a passion for if you want to do it, and it's not necessarily going to be lucrative for you for a long time. That doesn't mean that it's not worth doing. I think that it's nice. Certainly love the job because it is mission-based work, and I feel like I'm doing work that's really worthwhile and putting things into the world that improve scholarship and a lot of things that have been traditionally wrong with scholarship. But I do think that there are many moments that are disheartening that you have to work through, like when Dom came in and I had been already working at the press for several years and she was making significantly more money than me at that point. I think at that point when she started, I was making $14 an hour and she was making $17 or $18 an hour, something like that. And I really had no recourse for that. Like there was no way, because she was paid from an outside fellowship. I just had to know that. I would also just like to say as an aside that when you're going into this field, feel like there's not a lot of transparency about salaries and what people are making, but particularly with university presses, many of us work at public institutions and our salaries are a matter of public record. I encourage you to go look up mine. If you search Ohio State salaries, you can see the progression of my salary over the last 5 years. I think it's really interesting to note those things. And if that information is available to you, it's a tool that you can use to help when you notice that there's a gender equity gap, or that there's somebody on the same level as you with the same title as you that has a gap. Those are tools that you can use in order to try to improve your situation. But you also have to have a support system in place with your superiors and mentors they have to be willing to support you. And I've been very lucky throughout my career to have superiors who have always advocated for me with the greater institution that we work for. But I know that that's not the case for everyone. And so it makes advancement difficult in that way.
Thanks, Becca. That's actually the advice to look at salaries, other people's salaries, and talk to other people about their salaries where you can is really good advice for people at all stages of their career, I think. So thank you for that. Who else has some lessons learned that you would like to offer to people earlier in their career?
I just want to say that's exactly how I found out about my own pay scale. In like the nerdiest way possible, I was looking through like the gray books that the University of Illinois had to be like, oh, well, when did this editor before me stop acquired? Just like doing research, like actually for a question someone asked me. And then I was like, wait a minute, that's not what I make. And so those open access sources, and I'm now also part of a public University of Texas. However, there's not as easily a published way to find the data. You'd have to do like Freedom of Information Act, but could if you wanted. I think that like this is an industry and a career path where there are a lot of issues. We're discussing one of them today, but I'm grateful to be in one where we are discussing and taking stock. I think that it's maybe a silver lining, and it's one that I find incredibly rewarding, and I learn a lot from, because again, we're reading books by experts, and I find that validating. But one thing I've learned, and this could probably be applied to anything and not just this industry, but you're your best advocate. So being equipped with like information, like Becca was talking about, is something I learned the hard way. Like no one's going to give me something if I don't ask. And I think that's especially the case for money.
Thank you. I kind of want to take what you just said and go on to the next question. But before we do, Amy and Dom, is there anything else that you would like to add on this?
I think that what I would add is always be transparent about how much you make. I mean, we can go into it later. I have had the benefit of being able to work with people even before I've gotten to presses. I've called and done informational interviews. I usually try to do it with some of the younger folks at the press. There's usually a little more transparency. I think the culture is changing around it. And I had one of my coworkers at UNC, he told me how much he got paid. He's like, this is how much I got paid when I started. This is how much when I got my promotion, what I got. And so I was able to kind of see the trajectories at the different positions of what people were going to be getting paid. And I've also asked in an interview, I can't remember what's the phrase I use, but I will ask something like, what's the allocated budget line for you to fill this position? So that I can kind of see at least a range. And, usually expect that you'll get paid at the bottom of whatever range they tell you. But I think it just gives you a nice, precursor to what the culture of the press is as well. And I think that I really do enjoy working at presses where, again, it's been really transparent. And I don't believe I would probably even work at a press at this point that wasn't transparent in any way about what the money looked like and what the opportunities for professional development and advancement looked like.
That's a good point. I will say, I think there are very few, if any, commercial presses that have any degree of transparency other than the highest paid people who have to get, that does get declared. But I think there's a lot to be said for university presses and the high degree of transparency there is there. Amy, is there anything you wanted to add?
I think in the interest of time, I'm just going to say that my co-panelists have all given very good advice.
Okay, thank you. So I wanted to then segue, Dawn, from something you said into the next question, which is about how those of you that manage people, how you advocate for them, because you closed, Dawn, by saying you are your own best advocate, but I'm slightly going to push back on that and say, yes, you should be your own best advocate, but I'm not sure that I always have been my own best advocate. I personally find it much easier to advocate on behalf of other people. And as a manager, whether of staff or of freelancers, I think that's something you want to do, but how possible is it to do that? And what kind of, how do you see that working? What have you been able to do? What have been the barriers? What have been maybe any successes that you've had. Amy, should we start with you since you didn't chip in on the last question?
Sure. So I guess I can speak as a managing editor who hires freelancers and a freelancer as well. And so being a freelancer kind of inflects how I am as a managing editor, I hope. Other people even here on the panel or listening might disagree with what I have to say. This is just going to be like one person's perspective, but everyone in our freelance pool gets the same baseline rate. And so that necessitates us having to pay by project length rather than hourly. The rationale here is, on the one hand, we have someone who like prints out manuscripts and marks them up by hand and then inputs the changes. And then on the other hand, we have someone who's very clever with macros and automating a lot of the repetitive tasks, right? So, from my end, they both give us great work, and the work that they give us has kind of a flat value. But, one, I wouldn't want to pay hourly, and the other one we might. So as a managing editor, a baseline per page rate kind of makes the most sense to allow our freelancers the discretion to find tools that make their work more efficient and easier on themselves and still be paid the same amount in the end. And then on the one occasion when I posted a call for freelancers, and whenever I respond to a freelancer who's cold emailed me, I'm transparent about our rates and our expectations about what the job entails. And since I stepped in as a managing editor about 3 years ago, I think, I've been able to give our copy editors raises a couple of times. So I wanted to talk a little bit about that. The first raise was basically me coming in and saying, like, I wouldn't work for this rate as a freelancer myself. But I realized, our budget is constrained, and my now boss was basically doing 2 jobs at once. And so like, there wasn't really a way for us to have a higher rate. So, I came in and I was like, I'm going to try to do everything I can to make things more efficient, to make things run more smoothly, and take on more projects in-house so that I can stick to our budget and also give our freelancers a raise. And fortunately, he trusted me, and more fortunately, I didn't crash and burn. And so the second raise was actually prompted by a freelancer letting me know that even with that previous raise, our rates were lower than she could take on consistently. And so I brought that to my boss. And by that time, I had a track record of increasing efficiency and staying within the budget. So again, it was okay for me to give a raise. But so in the context of the equity discussion that we're having here, whenever the rate has gone up, I've raised the rates for the whole pool and not just the one person who raised the issue. And I think that that's important because all of these people are valuable to us. They all have their own skills, and we want to have them keep working for us. And honestly, also, I don't want to have one person be our lowest paid freelancer and try to dump all of our projects on them because they're the cheapest, right? Because especially if that's going to lock them into taking on a lot of work with us when they could otherwise be getting jobs from a range of clients and increasing their earning that way. So we pay now just a bit over the median per page rate for university presses, which I want to emphasize is still lower than the average rate on the Editorial Freelancers Association chart. There's not a lot that I can do with our budget, but like I said, I've tried to give raises where I possibly can by taking on more projects in-house and being more efficient. I try to be flexible about scheduling and to make sure that our manuscripts are well prepared. And I think all of that kind of keeps us in the mix with our freelancers. Those things are important to me as a freelancer. And I know that they can make a difference when a freelancer is just trying to book up as many jobs and cast as wide a net as possible. So if we can offer consistent work and be good to work with, then it's easier for freelancers to fit us in, even when our rates aren't maybe as competitive as others. That said, we could certainly do better with active recruitment from a more diverse population. I never see our freelancers face to face. So as far as I know, I'm not like actively discriminating, but I also haven't actively recruited new freelancers in a while. And so, as you know, our roster is probably pretty homogenous. So I know that passivity is not how you get to a diverse and inclusive, staff. So I would like to do better on that front.
Thank you. I love the fact that you came at that question from both a sort of business and an ethical perspective. That was really, that's what we should all be striving for, I think, to get that balance right, so that, you know, we're not just making purely business decisions, but we probably can't just make ethical decisions, but getting that balance right. So thank you for that. Dawn, I'm going to hand this over to you next, because in your newish position, you're in a position where you have more people reporting to you, I think, than you've had before. So how do you tackle this issue?
Yeah. Well, first, I really want to thank you for pushing back on my comment about being your own best advocate, because it made me realize, like, oh, well, that perspective is more a product of like my own experience than necessarily the way I really view my role as a manager. So like, I just had an epiphany right here. But thinking through some of these things, I mean, even before I became an editor-in-chief, I did always try to approach, well, for very many years, as I'm like always learning, try to make sure that professional development is like entwined with my practice of being like a publishing professional. And what I've tried to kind of remind myself of all the time, that professional development is helping people get to where they want to be, which isn't necessarily where I think they should be, right? Like, it's where they want to be. Sometimes that's no longer publishing. Sometimes it's not university press. Sometimes it's not acquisitions. But these are things that I think are really important to like remember. There's like just not one kind of path. And so what I realized though was it's really helpful. Like, I was like, oh, but I don't really have a seat at the table to make some of these, like, to be accessing some of the bigger level discussions. Now that I kind of have the like at the seat at the manager table, I'm like, oh, well, there's still all these hurdles. But when I approach it, I try to think about that, like an equity of communication on a daily basis. You know, making sure that I'm being as communicative as I can about the realities of like, well, is there even the opportunity of raises and things like that, and trying to make space for people to talk to me about things, because you know, I understand that maybe a person can't only advocate for themselves, other people can advocate for them. But as much as I can try on every day, like to know what's going on, unless someone is like, hey, did you know that this was a problem? Like, it's the multiple perspectives that I think are really helpful as well. And, you know, just traveling through my own life and different things that I learn about, like, oh, okay, well, what is something that seems commonplace, like conference travel as part of acquisitions? Well, what hurdles does that present if you're having to like put the money up front and then get reimbursed later? Or how does that affect, like, if you are, you know, you have a child care to deal with, or elder care, or things like that. So I don't have one concrete answer, because it's just so like multivalent, and I hope it's somewhat helpful to be transparent about how I'm always balancing trying to learn more with like appreciating the challenges of it.
That was really helpful. Becca and Dom, do either of you have anything to add, or should we go on to the next question, which I know you have lots to say about? But please, if you have anything to add on this, please do say. Okay, so this is the question that I've been dying to ask both of you, because I know you've been doing a lot of thinking, a lot of working on it, which is, what do you see as the biggest barriers to pay equity? I'm going to let you fight it out between you as to who starts that.
First, I think it's such a loaded question, right? Because the barriers are so different depending on who you are and where you are and what part of your life you're in. I think that what Amy spoke about in terms of, you know, location-based bias is a really important thing. And it's even in the way that I have progressed in my own career. I have definitely, I don't think I've ever spoken about this publicly before, but I interviewed at some point with Dawn for a position way back when at Illinois. And ultimately, that would have been a great job for me. And I really was excited about the position, but it was so far away from my family and my support system that it was just not like tenable at that point in the greater scheme in my life to do that move. And there's just a lot of expectation in this field that you're going to move for positions and have the finances to fund that, and just be okay with leaving support networks behind and sort of starting over again and again. I think that's obvious with Dom talking about the many, many, many jobs she's had in the past 3 years and the moves she's had to make. And I think that that's just a really key thing that has always been sort of an expectation that to get ahead, you have to go somewhere else. And I'm hopeful that with some of the changes that we've seen in the industry due to COVID, that we're breaking away from the location-based model a little bit. And I don't think that that's necessarily a barrier for a lot of people, but I think it has been a thing traditionally that if you go to a large state school in the Midwest, let's say, your university press might be the only publisher in your state. It's very different than if you live on the coasts, and that, you know, most people live in the middle of the country. So there's a lot of us here. So I think that it's one thing that I consider all the time, because I think that we've all seen ways that opportunities either come to us or pass us by based on our locations. And it's hard to feel like you're not in the right place at the right time, because a lot of that has to do with luck and not with skill or what you've earned or any of that in the industry.
I will just add that even those of us that live on the coast sometimes struggle to afford to live here. So my oldest son lives and works in New York in publishing, and he's okay now, but it was very tough for him for a few years. So Dom, what would you like to add on this? What do you see as the biggest barriers to pay equity?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it is exactly what Becca said. And I think even more so than that, I think conventional career advice that you might be able to use in other career spaces doesn't really work here. I think a lot of what you see is advice when you're like, you know, if you want a pay raise, you know, interview for another job so you can see what your market value is. And you can use that to kind of counter whatever offer you might be being given at the press that you're at or whatever institution you're at. But like Becca said, if you're the only, in most cases for many people, it might be the only press in the state or even the area. And so then there's the part where if you get a position, are you actually prepared to move? Are you actually prepared to take it? Because oftentimes you will counter, which I can say, transparently, I did counter and I asked. I really wanted to say, I'm like, I just moved down here a year ago. I'm really not trying to leave. If there is a comparable position I said, even in 12 months time, is that something that's possible? I'll wait on it. And the answer was no. And so you have to be prepared to actually take that job, regardless of where it's at. And so and I always say, and I'm one of the lucky ones. I don't have a family. It's me and my little dog packing up my car and moving wherever we want to. But that does come at a personal cost. Like I said, making social networks and putting down roots in places. I always say the older I get, I do feel like I'm slowing down and like I kind of want some of those things. And it's hard to do that until you get to like that full editor position. One of the main barriers to equitable pay, I would also add, is that I just lost it how I was going to say it. So many people do so much free labor here. And so you actually don't know. I would actually be frightened to see how much it would actually cost to run this industry if everybody was actually paid for the hours that they actually worked. The understanding for many early career professionals, the unspoken rule is that you're supposed to work 40 hours, especially if you're not getting on the job training of doing acquisitions work. You're taking that work home and maybe asking your boss, can I developmentally edit this manuscript on my own time? And so like I said, all of that starts to add up. A lot of the organizational work we do, doing panels and being parts of committees, all of that is unpaid work. Part of the work that me and one of my fellow editors at the press that I'm at now do, we're putting together a professional development kind of like incubator. And while, it'll look good on our resumes, we're not being compensated for any of that. And that really is something that we want to be a mainstay that outlives. So all of these things, like I said, I would say it would be scary to see how much it actually costs the labor here in this industry. And I think that that's a really, it's a large barrier. In addition to a saturation of the market, you can throw a rock and hit many people with advanced degrees in the humanities. And so that doesn't entice employers to want to pay you more, because if you leave, that position will be filled within 6 weeks, easily, with someone that's just as brilliant as you. And I think it does keep labor costs down.
Yeah, it's a really good point. Somebody works for a not-for-profit organisation that relies very heavily on volunteer help. I'm acutely conscious of the fact that, there's a lot of unpaid work that goes into enabling us to do what we need to do for the benefit of the community, but it's still, particularly for people who are already, underpaid and overworked, it's a big ask. So thank you for raising that. Dawn and Amy, is there anything you'd like to add? What you see as the biggest barrier to pay equity?
I mean, I think publishing has some catching up to do in terms of salaries, because the baseline was unpaid internships for so long. And I feel like we're starting to see a change. But if you have, generations of workers who were somehow able to start at zero, whether they had a partner or they came from money, I feel like that kind of depresses the salaries for a whole industry and the expectation that it is a low paying industry, and you only go into it for the money. So I feel like the industry as a whole has a lot of catching up to do.
Yeah.
I also think that one barrier is that so many presses are really at the whim of their parent institutions, and they are not invested in, it's these rules to apply to across the university for these everyone treated equal issues, but equal, does not mean equitable. And so a huge barrier, in addition to all these other ones we're talking about, really shitty advice of you have to move, in these expectations, is just there's just impenetrable institutional forces of that are not they're keeping wages down for whatever reason they have. And so I think that is, from my manager perspective right now, the number one thing, right? There's all these rules, and how do you find loopholes in a massive institution, and any institution, not just UT.
Really quickly, I'd love to piggyback off of that. It makes collaboration and joint efforts to kind of change things at an industry level really difficult, because what works in one institution in one state is not applicable somewhere else. Even, the difference is, I've worked at mostly, I think, public school institutions, and 3 of them, and all 3 of them are so different. They're all the large, state school of that state. And there's very little that you can even transfer when it comes to navigating the loopholes and the red tape.
Yeah, really good point. And actually, in the chat, somebody's just noted the same thing, that remote work at university presses varies wildly as well. So different universities have different policies and rules, including limits on which states qualify for out-of-state work and that kind of thing. So really, to your point, Dom, absolutely. I also just want to pause for a minute and thank you to those of you who are starting to post questions in the chat. Please do continue, because we've got a couple more questions for the panel, but we would also, I think, love to hear any questions that you have or comments that you have. And there is one point of clarification, maybe, Dom, that you could help with. Somebody has asked or said they'd be interested in hearing more about the incubator you just mentioned. So maybe we'll just divert for a minute or two on that.
It's Allison's in here. Hi, Allison, girl. Our little incubator project is our hypothesis, our thesis is that you can teach somebody how to be a competent acquisitions editor in a year's time, and do that intentionally. The idea is that you learn a lot of what we do here through osmosis. It's through observation. And I've gotten advice. It's don't ask your managing editor or your acquisitions editor you work for acquisitions opportunities, and just sit back and learn and, see what they teach you. And that's not me at all. So the idea was, if we have, once a month, or we do kind of this, I wouldn't call them brown paper bag lunches, but we do some part of the acquisitions process, working through it, everything from subventions and grants to how do you read through a proposal, how do you send a rejection, how do you review, how do you look for peer reviewers, all these things that seem very intuitive now, but that it took a long time kind of picking up and watching how people do it. And so the idea was, if we could actually do it once a month, like I said, teach the assistant editors actually so that they could feel competent and confident in their acquisitions capabilities a year from now. That it's a better way to professionally develop people to where they actually believe that they're getting something out of the process. Since I have no control over what people get paid, I'm like, well, this is, some way that I could hopefully provide some oxygen where people actually feel like they know how to do this job and they can go somewhere else in a year or 2 years' time and compete with anybody. So that's kind of the incubator program.
I love that, and it's making me want to do another interview with you for Stolly Kitchen about that, but that's a topic for another occasion. But it maybe is a nice segue again, and along with another comment from Joel in the chat, that one of the ways that at Leeds University Presses, and I think this is probably true across other types of organisation as well, make up for low pay is through other sorts of benefits, and several of you have mentioned this sort of along the way. So our next sort of official question is, what do you think, how can these barriers be addressed? What are some ways of breaking them down? And, maybe this is one approach would be to sort of think holistically about the package that you're getting, not just about literally the pay element of it, but what do you all think in terms of, what are some ways that the challenges around pay equity, the barriers around pay equity could be broken down? Amy, should we start with you? Sorry, I didn't mean to put you on the spot. You can say no.
I feel like greater transparency would always be more helpful. And, I don't know how much of this is possible. I'd be interested to hear what Dawn says. I know that there are limits on what directors and managers can offer because of the universities. But, just being transparent. If a job is being open to remote candidates, say it in the job ad. If you're limited, if your salary offerings are being dictated by the university, say it in the job ad. Would be so helpful to someone who has looked for jobs and tried to find information on pay at other jobs, because we have to do so much job hopping. I mean, I say we. I haven't left Pitt in 11 years, but people in publishing have to do so much job hopping that it is a big commitment to move to a new place. And so it would be helpful to know if it's worth your time applying for a job in another state in order to move up pay-wise. So I'm a big advocate for transparency wherever possible.
Yeah, 110% agree with that. It's a great point. Dawn, is there anything you'd like to add?
I mean, I'm just reading over Joel's comments about the fringe benefits, which aren't available if you aren't local. I think that is when we have all these barriers to pay equity for like dollars and paychecks, it is sometimes managers do have more flexibility in other things of value. And I don't think that anyone wants to substitute things for, money going to your retirement to secure your future or paying your bills. It's not the best substitute, but maybe there are things like when we're talking about professional development, are there ways to give people chances that would then get them to their next pay level, even if it's like going to another job? For instance, we talked about I mentioned conferences earlier. Does going to more conferences help you get more experience, more networks, more even networks? Like that's something I could maybe offer an early career staff person. Little things that you think are maybe of value to you that aren't money, which would be the ideal, right? I think this thing about health insurance is interesting. I noticed it myself when I was remote working before moving to Texas. I had a different premium and different coverage. We see like tuition benefits sometimes for people who are working or children. Yeah, these are all great, but they deeply concern me that we're like still not able to figure out the thing of the dollar signs. So I know that's not very optimistic, but it's me being candid.
No, it's a good point, and it actually ties in really well with the question we've just had in asking what do you think about the title promotion that does not include a pay raise? And I'm pretty sure we've all been on the receiving end of a version of that, or had to fight against that anyway. So how, if you don't mind, a little segue to answer that, because I think it actually it ties in quite nicely with what we're talking about. Becca, how do you feel about that? I think this has come up when we've talked before. So
yeah, I think this is something that I've had a lot of experience with, and I think in the industry in general, there's a lot of chatter about being given the privilege of more responsibility because you've earned it without pay to meet that. I had a situation with my position specifically where I was promoted, and it was in response to getting a position, an offer somewhere else. And then the university, because of all of the barriers that happened there, did not put through my raise and title change for that position for 11 months after that happened. So I was continuing at that moment in time to make minimum wage and not have benefits because the university, the barriers were happening, but I had taken on all of this responsibility and was doing that job. So at that point, right, I've been doing this job for almost a year. And when I come up on my next review period, I'm not eligible for a raise in that position because I haven't been given that salary yet, right? So it's like a chain, you know, it's just like dominoes falling that set you back so much. And I think that, you know, we need to think about the ways that burden is placed on people at the lower end of the food chain and the ways that things disproportionately affect people who just make salary in general. I think there's often a lot of barriers to changing salaries, but for example, most people who work for UPs have to pay for parking on campus if they're in person. But if I make $20,000 a year, that affects me a lot more than if you make $75,000 a year. And the way that is part of my monthly finance considerations. Or even, you know, if we're throwing staff birthday parties or things like that, that are fun things that we should all like participating in. But if you're asking everybody equally to bring food or like participate in that kind of thing, what kind of burden you're placing on your early career staffers by asking them to do something like that. And of course, everybody, I think, in those situations would say, oh, you don't have to do anything. But of course, you're going to feel like a little bit of an ass if you're the one person who doesn't bring food for a birthday party. Yeah. So I think there's a lot of times that we treat responsibility as a privilege, but we don't back it up with money for many, many reasons. And it just sets people back in their careers for years and years. And it's hard to put your foot down and say, I'm not going to take on this responsibility because you feel like the opportunity will pass you by. But it really, truly does not help you get ahead in the long term to take on more responsibility without the pay that you should be getting for it.
Yeah, thank you. I'm going to ask you a follow-up question, which just you don't have to respond to. So I'm sorry to put you on the spot, but do you think you would, with hindsight, because hindsight is always 20/20. Do you think you would have handled that situation differently now if you were in the same position?
That, I had these types of conversations earlier in my career. So I would have had a sort of support network in the industry saying that might not be the best way to get ahead, or you should be looking at different kinds of opportunities, or this is how you push back about those kinds of things. But it's hard to say because I finished undergrad in 2012, so right in the middle of this awful recession when jobs for English majors were very, very scarce, especially I was in upstate New York at that point and then moving to the Midwest. And so a lot of my career until a couple of years ago really was predicated on the idea that you're lucky to have a job and you don't want to turn anything down ever. And I think a lot of people go into the job industry at this point, we're in another sort of economic crisis situation where they don't want to turn anything down. So it's hard to say that I would do anything different in that position because I just felt like I needed to prove myself that I was committed, that I wouldn't want to take back the commitment that I had to my job, but I also would want to have valued myself more and would perhaps have been in a position for longer where I was making a viable salary for a period of time.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, and I think the fact, and you've all in different ways at different times alluded to this, the fact that we are all in this business because we love it, we're passionate about it, we think it's important, we think in our own ways we're contributing to something that is making the world a bit of a better place. So it's not, I think if you don't care so much about your job, maybe it's easier to walk away from those kind of situations, but when you care about what you're doing, it's really hard to say no to extra responsibility that you want to take on and that you can see you can do and that's going to be a good opportunity for you. So it's very complex. Thank you, Becca, for sharing that. I want to then sort of riff off that a little bit with another question from the audience. Joel asks, earlier someone said, I think this is you, Dawn, that you're your own best advocate. Do you have any thoughts on staff coming together as a group to advocate for themselves as a group? And maybe that would be one way of breaking down this barrier a little bit. Dom, what do you think about that?
Well, yes. And to piggyback kind of even off of what Becca said, one of the barriers again is so much of this work is collaborative, and so a lot of an issue that happens at many presses is where someone will leave. And it's easy to say like, okay, well, this work's just not going to get done until the position's filled. It's not possible. Like if the person who codes all the manuscripts leaves, like somebody has to do it. So what often ends up happening is that people end up chipping in and taking on that work. And that position, I've been in spaces where like that position might not be filled for years because maybe someone even forgot that it was an actual position and no one's getting paid more to do that. And again, because we all love this work. And like I said, it's so collaborative that we have to, like, you can't not do it. So it's easy to say to refuse work, but like in reality, like how would that actually even work? I don't even have an idea for that. And yeah, I think advocating for not only yourself, but advocating for each other. I don't know what collective work looks like in doing that. I haven't been at an institution that is unionized. I do know that there are presses that are in the process of unionizing. And so I think it would be great to have somebody who's actually doing that work come and talk or, do some writing about it. So the question was about collaborative work, right? Yeah. I think it's possible. I don't know what that looks like in a university press space. What I understand about that type of collaborative work is really at larger institutions and in larger companies. So what does it look like for a department or a press of sometimes as little as 5 people to advocate in that way? And I think the needs at different levels for different people can be so different and so varied that it does make it really difficult. So I don't know, I guess I would call for people to be imaginative. One of the things, the pushbacks that I always make, I always say that you can advocate the best for yourself before you've taken the job. So when they're more likely to listen to you. I don't know if I mentioned earlier, but I advocated for remote working 100% of the time at this new position. And I don't think it's something I would have been able to do if it wasn't COVID. And I don't think it's something that's oftentimes allowed for people that are earlier on in their career. It's seen as a perk. And so moving into that, I think there's so many things that have been described as like, oh, this is a perk or you're lucky to get that. And it's like, well, the context of the work we do has changed so much that these need to be seen as more, they're not compulsory anymore, or more compulsory and not, again, just like added bonuses that you get.
Yeah. Okay, well, I want to, we've got about 10 minutes left, and I do want to give you all a chance to answer our last question, because I think this is one of my favourite questions that we agreed we would talk about, which is kind of what can we actually do? What could we expect organisations, and I guess for all of you in particular university presses, but maybe your answer will encompass potentially a wider range of organisations as well. So what kind of big change do you think is needed to address this issue, and what small thing could any organisation do really that has no excuse really for doing that would actually make an impact? So I'm going to let you answer one or other or both, depending on what you would like to say. But I'd like each of you to answer at least one bit of that, please. So I'm going to start with Amy, I think, please.
I don't know if I can speak to what organizations can do, but I could speak a little bit about what I think is important for people at organizations to do. And I feel like the biggest thing that you can do if you're in a position where, you know, you're beyond entry level, early career, is if the understanding is that there aren't necessarily going to be opportunities for people to move up within the press and that they have to move on, then it's really a responsibility to you to make sure that you're giving people professional development opportunities as much as possible. I feel. I think it's incredible that, Dom, you're putting together that incubator. That sounds amazing. I wish that had been around, you know, when I was in EA. So if you're in a position where you can do any kind of mentoring, I think that's great. I think even if, like, I don't have anyone to mentor directly, but I do a lot of yelling on Twitter, and I feel like that's kind of part of a, like, diffuse mentoring, peer-to-peer kind of mentoring. Like, I'm sharing resources and sharing, like, ways that I know of to do the job. So, you know, even building in little opportunities like that, if you are in a position to offer what help you can to other people, I feel like you should do it.
Thank you. Dom, what about you? Is there a big thing and or a small thing that you think university presses or other organisations could do to address this issue?
Dom or Don?
Sorry, Dom. I'm looking at you.
I'm always advocating for moving away from the 5-day work week and moving away from the 8-hour work day. I don't think it's necessary. I think we work too much. I think something John said in one of the comments is I think we work way more hours now than people did in the past. I think even with the automation that's happened in a lot of work that we do, I think the fact that we still work 40 hours, as if those 40 hours are the same 40 hours, is a little ridiculous in my opinion. I think standardizing remote work at all levels, because the idea was that remote work was for more advanced people, because the idea was that you couldn't onboard somebody that wasn't physically there. And with the fellowship, which was one of the one spaces where people were still being hired during COVID, I think that it proves that no matter the position, you can actually teach somebody this industry remotely. And I know people that have onboarded at institutions that they've actually never stepped foot in. And so I think that it's like a silly excuse to not allow that anymore. He said, I've heard there's like horror stories of like assistants being asked to go in 5 days a week to assist editors that aren't there ever. And I just like I said, there's some things that are better about being in the office, but I think that type of expectation is just such an old school way of thinking that I just don't think it's really effective anymore. So I would think about how are we really using the resources that we have at our disposal now, and how are we actually making them run a little more efficiently.
Thank you. And 100% agree on the working too hard. As a European, I'm constantly shocked by how, not only how little vacation people here get, but they don't even take the vacation that they're given a lot of the time. It's extraordinary to me. So yeah, whether it's more vacation or shorter working weeks, I think there's a lot to be said for that. Thank you. Becca, I'm going to pass it to you next, because I know you and Dom have, again, done quite a lot of thinking about this.
I think a lot of conversations about this, and I think that we all know that there are institutional barriers to remote work, to changing the work week structure. But that's not to say that there isn't flexibility within every organization to, you know, say, okay, I can't officially give you a 4-day work, but I can say this is your day where nobody's going to bug you on email and nobody's going to Slack you, and you're going to be doing this set of professional development tasks, and that's how you're going to get ahead. Or nobody expects you to answer the phone or be on a Zoom meeting this day. I think that there are ways that we can relieve the burden of work that is placed on people many, many days a week without decreasing productivity. And I think that we all know that we have a threshold for productivity that's not 40 hours, even if our butts are in chairs for 40 hours a week. I think it would be interesting as an see what happened if we all just worked 4 days a week, because I think many of us would get the same amount done, or possibly more. So I think for me that's one of the things that's just, we're working too much for little gain, and we need to think seriously about the ways the ways that that is affecting our long-term activity and burnout. And I think that's especially present now that oftentimes where we're working is the same place that we're living, and there's so little separation between work.
Yeah, I completely agree. My former organisation, Orchid, actually now does, I can't remember if it's first Friday or fourth Friday, but one Friday a month, the whole organisation closes down. They have no meetings. I mean, unless there's something absolutely critical, they have a day off a month, a Friday off a month, the whole organisation, which is, to your point about experimenting, that's actually quite a nice, more than a toe in the water, but not a complete immersion kind of approach to that, isn't it? So maybe that's an example to follow. Dawn, what about you?
Yeah, for some of the bigger things, I think it just hits home that I think what a lot of us have talked about, maybe all of us, is that we need to stop treating the perks as exceptional and stop treating the extras as the norm. Like, that would be huge. If the big change would be, we all just say, remote work isn't the privilege anymore. It's just one tool in our toolkit to make things more equitable. I think that would be huge, revolutionary in a way. Small thing though is do what we're doing now. Talk about it. Ask about it. I'm always surprised when a manager is surprised when I bring up a raise during my annual evaluation. And I'm always surprised when someone I'm doing an annual evaluation with doesn't bring it up. The answer might be no, but I think everyone should like embrace the idea that talking about a raise and asking about it is just something off the menu to talk about. And the more we do it, not only with managers or not only with, people where maybe you're in a hierarchical structure in terms of the press ladder, but like talk to your colleagues, like build community in your press, but also outside of it, because like that's a thing that we're all learning from one another here. I mean, I'm learning from all of you. And so I think these small things are just really, like we've been talking about, transparency. I think we'll normalize it eventually, hopefully.
Thank you. I love that. And that's taken it very neatly back to your point about we should be, even if we don't feel we always are, our best advocates, and talking to colleagues and being transparent with other people and being okay with talking to people about money and about raises is a really good start to that. So thank you. So I think we officially have 2 minutes left to go. I don't know if there are any more questions, but I think we can certainly stay on for a few minutes more if anybody does have any other questions. And if not, then I will hand it back, John, to you and Pooja.
I do want to thank you all for this great conversation. I think it was very interesting and I think helpful for people at all stages in their career. The only thing I would add to this that didn't quite get mentioned about pay equity, and I'll say this for everybody, is always negotiate salary, always. It's not always possible, but it's always worth trying. You don't necessarily want to ask for too much, but make sure to ask for something. And so a couple of people mentioned moving, which also puts on a burden. So don't neglect to ask for relocation, which may not be offered, but is usually available if they really want you. That's all I'll add to that. Pooja, you want to add anything else to that?
No, I think just that this can continue to be an open conversation. And I think if we demand transparency from employers and potential opportunities, that we can also do some of that on our own in a really honest and kind of set aside our ego way, so that we're also supporting one another in terms of development and giving people opportunities as a community. But it takes these kinds of conversations to really make that happen. So I'm so grateful for all of you for being so candid and for being very transparent about your own experiences, both good and not so good.
Yeah, I'm glad to have this conversation here as part of the conference. And Alice mentioned earlier that, being the older person, and that's probably me here. And I could definitely say, in my earlier generation in publishing, you really didn't have these kind of conversations around pay and equity. It's really great to see that happening these days. So I want to thank our panelists here now and all of our panelists over these 2 days. I want to thank once again Pooja for helping to organize this conference. Want to invite all of you to watch the videos on demand that you may not have seen. They are available on this platform immediately. We will also be putting them on our Manifold platform, GW Manifold. They'll be there with the conference, and I invite everyone to consider putting in a proposal for next year's conference as well. So thank you again. Thank you, Becca and Dawn and Amy and Dom. Thank you
over the past 2 days.
And not some secret days, but 2 days. And thanks for all the audience as well for coming and submitting questions and interacting with each other.
And thank you, John.
It's been a pleasure. A lot of work, but it's been a pleasure.
Good night.
Adios. Adios.